So this is a recording of the Gemara on Mem Ham and Aleph, and for once we are actually on Mem Ham and Aleph. We are at the Mishnah, beginning the seventh parak, parak Shlosha She'achlu. Says the Mishnah, Shlosha She'achlu Ka'achas. You have three people that are eating together as one. There is a machlokes in the Mishnah. Does this mean that the three people started eating together as one, or were they eating separately and then they finished as one? Either way, that's not for our purposes now to explore further, but nevertheless, we are considering these three people who have eaten together as one. The halacha is chayavin lezamin. They are mechuyev to they are mechuyev to what do you call to eat. They are mechuyev. I'm sorry, not to eat. They have eaten together. They are mechuyev to be mezamin. Achal demai. So demai is the kind of food that we're not sure if it was taken off Trumas and Meiser. The halacha is that demai can be fed in certain instances to certain guests, for example, poor, etc. So achal demai. If somebody ate Meiser which was taken off the Truma, the thought is that we're talking about the Trumas Meiser that a Levi is mechuyev to take off, gets to a Kayed. Meiser Sheni. So we have a situation of Meiser Rishon Shenadol Trumasa. We have a situation of Meiser Sheni or Vehektish Sheniftu, either Meiser Sheni or Hektish that was Paida. So all these foods are permitted. Vashamish she'ochal kizayis, and a shamish, meaning the waiter, who was eating a kizayis together with the people who were sitting there. Ve'akusi, and a kusi, we're going to have to discuss exactly what these kusim were. The halach in all these instances is mizam that are able to have a zimun and say, as Rashi says, we can say nivarich. So that is the first part of the Mishnah. The second part of the Mishnah is what happens if you have a situation if you ate foods that are not appropriate. Achal tevel, right? If this person ate tevel, where it wasn't taken off the trumas, right? It wasn't taken off, so it wasn't permitted to be eaten. The same is true if it was ma'aser rishon into trumasai. If it was ma'aser rishon, which truma wasn't taken off from it. Ma'aser sheni hagdish niftu, you ate ma'aser sheni or hagdish wasn't paida. Or v'ashamash achol pachas megazayas, the shamash who ate less than a kazayas, v'anachi, or a mamash hagoy, ein mezam nalav. In all those situations, they can't be included in the zimun. Nashim avodim ktanim, ein mezam naleim. A new halacha about women, servants, young ones. Halacha is they're not to be included in the zimun. Ad kam mezam, right? How much does a person have to eat? As Rashi notes, kam yechal imam, how much do you have to eat together in order to be chayiv in the zimun? The halacha is machlokes, either at kazayas or budaim, or at kebeya. Either a zayas or a beya is disputed. So again, at this stage, Mishnah has told us that we have a new type of halacha. Halacha is zimun. People who eat together have to bench together. Rashi explains what does mean shlosha she'achlu lezamin lehizdamin yachel tzir bracha v'loshin rabim kigai nevarich, that you gather everyone together. You sort of invite everyone to be mitzdaref, and the way you do so is by saying nevarich. Not the Shumase, we explain again, Kesagdai, the Shumas Meiser, Shalosh al Levi Lahafresh. Meiser Sheni, what is Meiser Sheni? Shenifta, Latir Bachila, right? Once you're mat to the Meiser Sheni, then you're able to eat it. Chutz Yerushalayim, yes. And you'll take the amount of money that you used as the pidyon, you bring that to Yerushalayim and buy fruits over there and eat it in Yerushalayim. Shamash, Rashi Shem Shem Besuda, right? You have the Shamash who's the waiter, he's helping out of the meal. And he's eating with them kazayas. Why kadela it's starved in order to be included with them. Lazimun u'b'chalhani itzrach lashmin and afagav the damul iser and kam bracha ba'aver can farish v'azol. And in all these things, even though maybe it might seem like something that is not appropriate, and therefore in kam bracha ba'aver Well, we will have to explain why that's not going to be relevant. Ad kam mizamnin. What does that mean? Ad kam mizamnin. How much does one need in order to be able to have a zimun? Kam yachal imam. Yischav imam zimun. V'nafkamina lo hitziyam yidei chayvas and emitin le'akos levarach. And the nafkamina is in order to make the others with their chayva if you have the kais to bench. Says the Gemara, "Minani mili." So how do you know? How do you know what? The question of the Gemara is, how do you know that there's such a concept of joining together? Says Rashi, the shloisha ru'uyim leberchas tziruf. If you have three, it's roy to join together to bench. How do you know this? Says the Gemara, two different sources. Amar Rav Asid, Amar Pro Gadlu Hashem iti, Unrem Mashma Yachtav. Right, like what we say, Gadlu Hashem iti, Hashem, right, should be made great. These folks together with me, Unrem Mashma Yachtav, we should make his name great together. So what do you mean? You're using a plural word. You're saying Gadlu Hashem iti. You plural should do this together with me. Mashma, there's three. You're talking to two people. A Rava is a different source. Rava Amar Mehach Yikshem Hashem Ekra Avugad Elokenu. When you call, I'm going to call out to God. Let us make God great. So again, it's mashma. You're talking to like two others. Says Rashi Harei Shloisha V'chein Akra Havugad Hayachan Amal Shnayim. So to the pasuk of Havugad Elokenu, it's one person talking to two. So you have three in both instances. That will be the source for understanding that when you have three, you can start to bring Gadol Elokeinu, then you're going to have the Zimun. So Amar Rav Chanan bar Abba, or the side says it's Amar Rav Chanan bar Rava, Minayin la'ayna amen. So we have now other limudim that come out of this pasuk. So, and I should point out that the Rif just uses Gadol Hashem as the source, not the Shem Hashem Ekra, perhaps because the Gemara now learns out something else out of it as well. So I know that when you're saying Amen to a bracha, you shouldn't raise your voice louder than the person who made the bracha. Let's do it together, right? And together means that one's voice is not going to be way louder than the other one. So if somebody's making a bracha and you're saying Amen, and somebody's saying Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam and don't say Amen, right? That would be being Magbia Koilo Yesim and Amavarch. That would not be a situation of doing it in together. That would not be Yachtov. Another idea based upon this notion that doing things together means that the decibel of the voices should be similar. How do you know that the person who's reading the Torah, remember in those days, and the way the Yemenites, I believe, still do today, so you have a person who reads the Pasuk Chumash, and then afterwards you have the person who reads the Targum, and they're not to be like at two different pitches, two different decibels. So if Shimon Paz says, how do you know that? How do you know that the Matager is not permitted to raise his voice much louder than the Baal Kriya? Pasuk says that Moshe Rabbeinu spoke, and God answered him in a voice. Don't say that Hashem answered him in a voice. What do you mean Bekoil? What's the big advantage of saying Hashem answered him with a voice? Bekoil means with the voice of Moses. Doesn't mean literally that he sounded like it. Means that it was decibel was like it. We have a Bryce that's similar that says that a translator, the person who's reading the Targum, is not able to raise his voice louder than the Baal Kriya. And if it's not possible for the Mitargem, right, for the person who's reading the Targum to raise his voice for whatever reason, so maybe so then the Baal Kriya should lower his voice in order to sound at a similar decibel to the Mitargem. Fine. So at this stage, what we see is that we have a source to explain why we have to have Zimun, and that source could be used for other things as well, which is teaching us that one is to have similar decibel levels when one is saying Amen, and also that the Baal Kriya and the Mitargem should also be relatively similar decibels. Okay, So a few Taisasim that we haven't done. Maybe the first one we will do is the one about B'kaila Shel Moshe. So the pasuk tells us that Moshe Yidabr Elokim Yanenu B'Karl. Hashem responds in a noise with a voice to what Moses is saying. So Tess is asking, what does it mean? Who's responding to whom? Isn't Moshe Rabbeinu the one really responding to Hashem? So we'll go skip into the end of Taisus. So Perish Rif, the Kerlish Shal Moshe. What does it mean? The Kerlish Shal Moshe. Mistam Moshe b'chol kach ha'ayne. Moshe Rabbeinu is responding to God, probably screaming at the top of his lungs. Kidei lashmiya kerl l'chol am, in order for Moshe Rabbeinu to share with what he had heard from Hashem to the Jewish people. He had to really re-raising his voice. Avakadosh Baruch Hu lo hayitzarach l'harim kerle. But Hashem did not need to raise his voice in order to speak to Moses. Hashem only spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu, so he was able to speak very low. But nevertheless, Hashem still, as it were, raised his voice. So it shouldn't be that God's voice was lower than Moses' voice, and that Moses' voice was louder, as it were, than God's. And so therefore, the Kol Shel Moshe means that the way the Rif is learning, when the pasuk is saying Moshe Yidabr Elokim Yanenu B'Karl, is that Hashem, as it were, raised up his voice in order to be able to not be lower than Moshe Rabbeinu's voice. Fine. We also have the thesis of Shloisha She'achul Ka'achas. So again, the question is, what kind of situation are we dealing with? As I mentioned, were we dealing with three people that ate together as one? Did they're joined together at the end, and they finished as one? Like, what exactly were we saying? So if you look at the bottom part of Taisus, he says, "Rabbeinu Alphas Tevis Derech Rishon Iker." The Rif goes with the first approach, right? The first approach being the fact that people would sit down together at the same time to eat together. They all sat down together to eat as one. That's what it means. That's when they finally have a chav zimun on them. If everybody finished the meal at the same time, then they would be mechuyev to bench. But if they did not finish the meal at the same time, if one started the meal and then somebody else joined and then another person joined, they finish all at the same time, they're mechuyev to bench. But they don't have to; they can finish at different times. If they all started at the same time, they're also required to finish at the same time. Fine. And then we had the next text is of Achal Tavel Im Zamla. So Tesis here points out that if you look at the Gemara seems to be suggesting that we're dealing with a situation of food that is usher and mutter. Tesis says like this: if you have a situation where, let's say, a kohen is sitting with the Yisrael, a kohen is eating truma, and the Yisrael is eating chulin, nevertheless, they can still do zimun. What do you mean? They weren't able to eat biyacha. They couldn't all share like the same kind of food. So Taisus explains that we don't mean that they all had to be able to share the same food. What it means is each one had to be permitted to eat the food that they were eating. If one was if they were eating food that was usher that they were not allowed to eat, then there would be no chayvas zimun. Fine. Continues the Gemara. Idmar. Shnayim she'achlu ka'achas. The Mishnah told us that if two people eat as one, so then Pligi Rav Rabbi Yochanan. We don't know exactly which one is which, although Mechana seems to know. So if you have two people eating together as one, the Machlekes Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. One says that if they would like to bench, they're allowed. The Chara Omar. And one says, no, you can't bench. So in other words, when the Mishnah says, that means three, but three. If you have two, you can't bench. And the other man, the Amar, again, we don't know which one exactly at this stage, Says no, you should still be able to bench if you really wanted to. So the other more goes and brings in a series of rayas. We won't finish all of it today, but there are a series of rayas. So it's like this. Tanan. What's the first raya? Tanan. Our Mishnah said that three people eat together. Then they are mechuyev to bench. Shloisha and shnayim lo. That means three yes and two no. When do you say shloisha achal ka'achas hayavim lezamen? That's when you have three. But if you have two, then they're not mechuyev to mezamen. So you see that in the machlokes, whoever again, Rav or Rabbi Yochanan, one says mertzel zamen mezamen, v'chanam mertzel zamen ein mezamen. So it's a raya that you see the only three there's a chiyuv. But by two, there's no benching. So the Gemara says, no, that's not a raya that by when we say shloish shachlos chayavin that by two it's not to bench. It's not a raya. Says the Gemara. Hasam chay v'hacha rishus. We're talking about the difference between chay and rishus. We're not saying that. In other words, when you have three people who are eating together, they have to bench. That is lafugate two. That two they are not required to bench. But it doesn't mean that two that they're not allowed to bench. They could bench, but they would just be a rishus. And that, in fact, is the machlokes. Rabbi Yochanan. One Madama says that in Ratzu they could bench, and one says that if they Ratzu they can't bench. But the Madama says in Ratzu they can bench. Doesn't mean they have to bench. It means it's the rishus. So there's no proof in the fact that two are not allowed to bench. No, it just means that the two, if they would bench, they're not. If there are two people sitting together, they're not mechuyev, and if they want to bench, they could bench as a rishus. So it's not a right. Today's Gemara, another potential proof is Tashma. We have a brisa. Shloisha she'achlu ka'achas chayav lezamen vein rashayin lechalek. If you have three people eating together, they are mechuyev to bench, and they are not permitted to separate one from the other. Shloisha and shnayim lo. You see, three people are not allowed to separate, but two are allowed to separate. Again, wouldn't that be then a proof that by two that you don't bench? Says man, that's not a proof. Shani hasam the kavaloi b'chayva meikara. That's not a proof at all because over here, what's the situation? It was kavua to them a chayva meikara. In other words, how is it a chayva meikara? Because of the fact that when they sat again together, they were kaveh themselves a chiyuv. So in that situation, shani hasam the kavalu b'chayva meikara. So that's why they have to bench, and one of them cannot leave. But in a situation we had two people who are eating, so now we're going to say yes. By then they're not mechuyev to mezamen, and they are able to separate. It's not because they cannot bench; it's because they don't have a chiyuv to bench. As Rashi notes, shloisha and shnayim loy. The fact that we said they're not allowed to leave, right? They have to stay there. We want to say that means that even if the two want to bench, they're not allowed to. The Amishnaim Nami. Because if you wanted to say that if the two were allowed to bench, if they wanted the Amishnaim Nami Ratzum Zamnin, then why would we say that the one is not able to leave the meal? Lazilhu, when you have a case of three, let one of them leave. You will still have the zimun of the two that would be left over. So why are you saying that the one of them can't leave when you have three? If really two are allowed to bench, then you have two left, so they'll be totally fine. On that, the Gemara is answering, no, it's not a good source. Why not? Because of the fact Shani Hasan the Kavul B'Chayv Meikar, they had a chiyuv at the beginning. The Aizuhu Mafkislu, says Rashi. And if he's going to be leaving, he's going to be mafkir the chayv that he has. The kamalu b'rishus, right? And the gadol tzavaisa mishanim tzavaisa. So again, fundamentally, the person who, if you have shlosh she'achul ka'achas, the halacha is they are chayav l'zamin, and you're not allowed to have one of them leave. But it's not a proof that by shnayim you're not able to bench because of the fact that if you were able to bench, then why couldn't you just have one of them leave and then let the two remaining ones bench? That's not a proof because Shani Hasan the Kavlu B'Chayv Mikar, because they had a chiyuv at the beginning, and to go and be mafkir from his chiyuv, that no. But when you have two people, there's no chiyuv at the beginning. So can they bench? Sure, maybe they can bench, but there is no chiyuv to do so, no proof that you are or you are not allowed to bench when you have two. One more raya, the Gemara says Tashma Hasham Rishayim Mishamash Al Shnayim. If the Reda was waiting on two, he's allowed to eat with them. Even if they didn't give him permission. But if he was while waiting on three people, they wouldn't be allowed to be eating with them. Unless they gave him rishus. So again, this should be a situation where you see that if the two people um the two people are eating, that the sham is allowed to eat with them even without rishus, right? That's mashma what says Rashi Yishnaim is Zamnin. If two people are allowed to Zamin, then why is it that he's allowed to join with them even without their permission? They could bench regardless, even if he didn't join them. So the Mar says, no, it's not approved. As we turn the page, the Memham page, Shani Hasam, the Nichol, the Mik, Shani Hasam, the Nichol who, the Mikavaluhu b'chayva. That it's better for them to have a kfiyah as a chayv. In other words, because we say Gadol Mitzvah Ois and Mishan Mitzvah Ois, so the Gemara Kedushin, etc. So if that's the case, then we prefer that it will be a chayva rather than a rishus, and Mashnayim, it's only a rishus. So therefore, the Shams is allowed to join even without permission in order to make it a chayva, because Gadol Mitzvah Ois mimi she'enai Mitzvah V'Oisa. The Taisvis in Imratzu Lazamin Em Zamnin. So Taisa says that Rashi explains that this is true also with regards to Hamaitzi and Shar Brachas, that Yachas is not able to be Maitzi's Chaver. I didn't see this in this Rashi over here. I'm not exactly sure where this Rashi was, but it's not 100% clear to me where Taisa was citing from with regards to Rashi. But in any event, Taisa seems to suggest that you are able to have situations where you have Echam Mevarach L'Shnayim, as we have the stories earlier in the Gemara in Lamentes, Bava Kapara, etc. In any event, what we will do is or focus on is the answer of Taisa. Taisa says, "V'tam ha'il b'yoshvin lechol yachad daitan litzaref." When a person sits together with somebody else, they have a das to be mitzaref. One person could make a bracha, they might say their friend. And that is a bracha rishayna, like a bracha of hamaitzi, a bracha shel seis shudas and shemistachan zemizeh. But when you are separating from each other, right, as you would after you finished eating, so then the assumption is maybe there it should be different. So maybe tzarich levarach kol echav ve'echav atzmai. Maybe there you would say it's different. In other words, just because I see a Gemara where you have two people, one is able to be myself, one a bracha, etc., why is it then the difference by zimun? So Ted is saying fundamentally there's a difference between zimun and a bracha rishayna. A bracha rishayna, when you're sitting down, you're making a bracha with somebody else, so you're showing your dastim and sarf together. But at the end of the meal, when you're going to be going in separate directions, so then you maybe you should not be able to mention one to the other, given the fact that you have not intention anymore to be mitzdarf. Then Ted gives a second fundamental answer. Yesh mitartzim the yeshchilik bein burchas hamaitzi the loy havikim derabanan. There's not a difference between the beginning of the meal, the end of the meal. No, the difference is the kind of bracha. Kind of bracha that you make at the beginning of the meal of hamaitzi, that's just the rabbanon. Therefore, we're chilled about having a person be mitzvah somebody else with it. But so therefore we're going to be machmer. So in other words, Tez has two fundamental reasons to explain why is it that we're more mako when it comes to the beginning of a meal of having somebody mitzvah somebody else on a bracha than at the end of the meal. Tez has two possible permutations of answer. One is that there's something fundamentally different between the beginning of the meal and the end of the meal. The beginning of the meal, you're showing your dasim and starve together. So therefore, a bracha of one can be mitzvah another. At the end of a meal, since now you're about to separate, so therefore maybe your mindset is no longer there to mitzvah, so therefore you shouldn't be able to mitzvah another one. That's one possible fundamental distinction. The other possible distinction is that when it comes to the situation of bracha which is the drop banan, so then it's not really such an important bracha. So therefore, one person can mitzvah another one. But benching is a daraisa, so maybe then we will be more machmer and not let a person be mighty somebody else unless we're absolutely forced to. And so therefore, these are two possible reasons to explain the distinction between the bracha rishona and the bracha achrona in terms of when one will be more mako or and permit one to be yaitzi others. All right, we'll stop over here, and tomorrow we'll finish Mitzvah Mem Hey Amud Beis. Have a wonderful night.